Car audio has come a long way since the days of AM/FM radio and 8-track cassette tapes. Rock musicians turned audio gurus and car stereo installers would push the envelope for bigger and louder sound systems. This is the influence and impact of the car audio industry, presented by Powerbass.
So we just kind of finished out our series on movie cars. Maybe the next step, the next step would be probably TV, but we'll get to that later. But we're going to go into music, specifically car audio. It's interesting. They kind of also call it ICE. Not internal combustion engines, but in-car entertainment.
Yes.
Because obviously it's gone from just playing music to streaming podcasts to, CarPlay, GPS navigation, controlling your, air conditioning, controlling your seats, controlling a lot of the vehicle itself, beyond just, driving it.
Right.
And it's, I'd say in the last 40 years is really the jump and the huge increase in just the technology, the quality, and the industry behind it.
Right.
But of course, like everything, we're going to go back to the early days.
Well, we need to.
And just show the progression of how, radios first were in cars, then obviously it turned into, 8-track, cassette tape, your CD changers, your cars that go boom in the 80s, up until, now where you've got everything off your phone, but it integrates with your whole entire car.
Right. Well, like you said, let's think about this, that the car has been the perfect place to capture music because you're essentially in a small chamber for a long time.
You're in an enclosed space, you've got your windows, you've got your this and that. I remember this is probably 15 years ago, Alpine had you'd plug it in, it was kind of like a microphone. You'd set it in the very center of the car.
Right.
And then it would also measure, or you could look at the angle of the windshield, where the seats were to, where the sound waves were going to be reflecting to get that prime sound.
Right. Well, let's not get too crazy yet.
No,
we'll talk about there are actually certain cars that are better acoustic. So we'll talk about that too.
No, that's true for whether it's just, drivability, quality driving down the road, OEM style, or your crazy sound competition, aftermarket guys that are, going crazy with a wall of 12s and thousands of watts and just shattering windshields and making people's hair stand up.
Right.
But yeah, let's go back to, of course, the very beginning. I think we'll kind of brush through a lot of the early stuff.
Yeah.
A lot of the OEM stuff, get into some of the more milestones, and then the 70s is really when things started to change.
Exactly. So let's get to there because obviously cars had radios in them. Yeah. Obviously radio stations were very popular for entertainment.
Well, the radio for your family before there was TV or anything, it was right. Hey, Sunday night, everyone gather around the radio in the living room.
Yeah.
And so a lot of it was very similar technology to that, where, of course, they list 1904 as the first radio being in a car, but 1930 was kind of the very real first OEM integration. It was the Galvin brothers designed it, partnered with Motorola.
Right.
Here's the crazy part. How much do you think that the first car radio cost?
$100.
And we're talking back then.
Right.
So it was about a quarter of the cost of a brand new car.
Right. Yeah. They were expensive.
Was the cost of having that radio in there.
Yeah.
There was a few more things, like Philips made the auto radio.
Correct.
In the late 30s. And, what was kind of interesting with that is that, they had a dash control knob to, change the station, maybe adjust the volume. And then it was a floor mount unit.
Really?
So it was larger, and it honestly looked like a home radio.
Exactly.
And everything was all AM radio at this time.
Yeah.
FM radio didn't come about till the 50s.
Right. And even then it was very scarcely used until the 70s.
Yeah. And, back then too, there was, you had technology that was advancing with your transistors or your, vacuums and your tubes and stuff. And so the size of these were pretty big and expensive. They started making all transistor radios, but realized that they had to kind of mix and match and make hybrid versions to, keep it affordable. But that was all the 50s, like Blaupunkt, or I'll probably say that a couple times, say it wrong.
Blaupunk.
Blaupunk.
Yeah.
But yeah, they, were the first FM radio and an OEM manufacturer. But we also started to see, especially with the 8 tracks and stuff like that, some of the aftermarket guys, start to come in because cars were starting to be customized in the 50s.
Right.
The huge boom of going to the drive-in or going to the movie theaters, taking a cross-country road trip.
Right.
You wanted some tunes, with you, and rock and roll was coming about, and car audio was starting to really become a thing.
Well, I look at car audio and I look at the music industry as almost both hands reaching together. Because really honestly, think about the time the artist needed to play the music somewhere, and prior to the car, it was like you played at a dance hall,
or it was just your family one. But then kind of like the early TV days, like you probably were listening to Red Rider or whatever it was, Sunday night.
Right.
Your parents probably weren't going, hey,
let's put on that jazz music.
No.
That was,
we're not putting rock and roll and Elvis and stuff on in your family's radio.
And then you mentioned Elvis too, because what I also look at is the way that technology from the recording industry had a lot to do with car audio as well.
Yeah.
Elvis obviously at the time in the 50s was the biggest rock and roll star around. Well, he had a record player in his Cadillac.
Yeah. And that's what's crazy too. We think about like how much record players skip and all that. And they actually had like full 7-inch ones, but those were a lot more expensive and more messy. So most of the in-car record players were just a 45 single.
Right.
But compare that to the radio where, you were finally, at least with the record players, you were able to pick what you wanted to listen to. You
weren't relying on the DJ to play.
You weren't relying on the mafia that was paying the DJs of what to play, the payola scandals and all that stuff. So but that's really when it started. But it was still maybe radio in the dash, speaker in the dash.
Right.
Maybe some 6x9s or something on the package tray. But that's that was later on.
Yeah, it's later on, right?
Yeah.
And if you look at the way that the cars were designed, like you look at like the Impala lines from the early '60s, where the speaker is right in the center of the back seat.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
right?
It's part of the back.
It's part of the back seat, and the same thing too. Now that was
because it's probably like a 4-inch speaker.
They are.
Nothing
they're
crazy.
They're 4x6s.
Yeah,
right. Because it's the same speaker that's in the dash. Right now, if you think about it, the reason why they had that is because really AM radio ruled the world at that time, and they did most of the recordings on a mono recording.
Yeah,
so
we weren't getting stereo.
You didn't have stereo sound, so there was no reason to have multiple speakers. There wasn't a reason to have all this because the music just came out of the one speaker.
Yeah, and it wasn't going to sound much different. So you had one in the center for the people up front.
Right.
Had one in the back for the kids in the back.
And that's pretty much it.
That's all you needed.
Right.
But people started doing more. Like you said, the music industry started recording in stereo. I think wasn't like the Rolling Stones or something like that.
Rolling Stones, and I think even the Beach Boys were one of the first, because Pet Sounds was like one of the first stereo album recording that was offered.
No, and they made it like a big thing too. Where it would be like high fidelity, stereo sound, like all those logos and stuff on it. So, they were really touting that. And the 60s is also when the 8-track then came about. Well,
you have your 4-track player too.
True, but and that didn't stay as much.
Right. And there was a guy named Earl Muntz who was, it's kind of funny. He's kind of a weird kind of character because he had some Hollywood connections.
Okay.
And I don't know if that's because he would outfit cars, but also too, he was like the king of home entertainment. So he manufactured televisions, he manufactured hi-fi, stereo, cabinets, like we would call them, or entertainment centers, if you're an 80s kid.
Yeah. But now we just call it a TV and a sound bar.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
But Earl Muntz was that pioneer that said, like, look, we should have big stereo sound. We should have big home entertainments. And he didn't let just the home stuff do it. He wanted all that inside the car, too, as well. So a lot of those early, let's say sound systems that were in cars, they were Muntz systems. And he was the furthest guy away from this. I mean, this guy was like on billboards in Hollywood and would hang out with all these Hollywood different people. And I want to say he might have had a little bit of gangster connections too. So,
I mean, you are talking that time period and those kinds of things. And the music industry was very heavily like that. I mean, you mentioned the record player in the cars. Well, Frank Sinatra had one as well, you know, and he was definitely on that same level of mob connections, payola, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I think too on that, it's okay. Yeah. Now the music's sounding better. more fuller sound. You can get the quality in there. Okay, now you need speakers.
Right.
That'll play that. So probably, yeah, those musicians and those celebrities, they were probably, wanted all of his systems, but they were like appreciative that like, hey, now our stuff sounds good.
Exactly.
Right. And that's really kind of then transferred into the car audio world.
Yeah, yeah.
So
well, and a lot of these artists too, we're talking the music revolution of the late 60s in Los Angeles, for example. And that around there, everybody, of course, wanted to hear their record on the radio. But the funny thing about it was you're still listening to it in that monotone on that AM deal. Now in comes the 70s where we have FM radio that's broadcasted in stereo.
Well, yeah, and that's common now in everything. Like we mentioned, FM radios and cars came in the 50s, but still everyone was listening to the AM radio. It took a while to get to that point in the 70s where
and even the
it
FM
was common.
Right, and even some of the FM stations, they broke the payola thing. I mean, of course, it was still going on. Yes, there had regulations by then, but the AM stations were still doing it. And with the FM, they became the anti, which gave a lot of new artists, the artists that are very popular in our opinion now.
Yeah.
But it gave them a platform. That gave them like, hey, I can't make it on AM radio. Well, I'll go to FM radio.
Yeah, the new up-and-comers,
right.
underground stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
So, you have like your Aerosmith, for example, played on FM radio, which at the time, maybe in 1973, Dream On's probably like the top hit for them. But then AM radio is stronger, so now you're listening to Pat Boone.
Yeah,
right?
And that's the thing. It's kind of like AM's around. It's solidified itself. It's the
right
standard or the industry. So
but that's
now your old
radio.
stuff.
Yeah, that's your parents'
Now that's
radio.
your old stuff.
Yeah.
So if you're the younger guy, you're going to be that rebellious thing. And it's kind of funny. Just real quick thing is like we're in 2024 right now, and several car companies, more of the European car companies, are not even offering an AM capability in their car. I know Ford was going to, but then a lot of the emergency services still,
that's correct.
Who knows how many people still use it, but it was like, okay, let's still keep it in there.
Right.
And we started to see a little bit throughout, the 50s and 60s with some of the aftermarket guys. Al Brodsky of Allen Ed's, which is still around.
Yeah.
That store started up, in the 60s. And a lot of these, little audio shops, if you will, in the 70s especially, a lot of them were doing like CB radio installs.
Right.
Or doing multiband where it had AM, FM, CB
right.
all in one. And then, okay, well, now you need an antenna to capture the FM or whatever it is. So they were doing aftermarket antenna installs.
Right.
And that slowly obviously started to go away, and they just transitioned into stereo shops.
Well, the other thing too that we got to remember is at that time, a lot of DIY things going on too.
Yeah.
Right. And I know a lot of people right now listening to this might remember this, but there's a lot of young people that have no idea what I'm even going to say. The shop is called Radio Shack.
Not the Shack.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But that was the whole thing that now these DIYers that are looking for better sound, they might build their own soundboard. They might be building their own transistor radio. They might be building,
they're tinkering with stuff.
Right.
Electronics was becoming very more obtainable and more feasible to kind of figure out yourself.
Right. And again, too, going back to the recording, advancements, now we went from 4-track players to 8-track players. Well, again, now all of a sudden, hey, why don't we use an 8-track cassette?
Yeah.
Which was the first time people were like, oh, that's not a record. That's not an actual disc. This cassette, you're going to plug it into your stereo and you're going to get 8 tracks of sound. Yeah. That is just going to give you a bigger sound. So, of course, that was a big thing, right? That's your next jump up there.
Yeah, your next progression.
Right.
And all that. And also, too, you talk about the DIY stuff in the 70s. A company in 1974 came out called Crutchfield.
Okay, yes.
And, they were selling head units and selling some of this stuff, but they really made their mark on, and still even throughout the 90s, 2000s, because I remember using a lot of those resources of how-tos and applications and install guides because, you look at a car or a truck from the 60s or 70s, usually it was, if you were putting a different head unit or different radio in there, it was basically, okay, cut it out.
Right.
And then put it in.
Yes.
You didn't have a lot of options, but as things became more plastic or more molded and formed, you needed maybe a mounting thing or like how to do it. So Crutchfield really kind of capitalized on the installation, the DIY, the research. They were going out into the junkyards and taking measurements and stuff. And now obviously, 3D and data from the OEMs is there, but
back in the day, it was just go find it.
Just figure it out.
Go figure it out.
Yep.
And that's funny you mentioned them because, they were a powerhouse. They took the Sears robot catalog idea and would actually send you a catalog of new information if you were one. So, they were smart. They had great marketing. They had decent products. They lasted a long time.
Yeah, some of the mail order stuff was becoming common and popular. So you had your stereo shops and your audio shops. So if you're still rocking your stock stereo system, you need some help. And you need to go to Powerbass and check out their OEM direct fit line of speakers. Basically a plug and play operation on any newer Chevy, Ford, Dodge, Nissan, you name it. And I actually got a full set in my Toyota 4Runner. It sounds amazing, especially considering you're basically just replacing the factory speakers. So go check them out at powerbassusa.com. Use the code AUTOREV24 and you can get 10% off anything on the site, including these cool little Bluetooth speakers. This one right here is the Sound Cube. Clip it onto your backpack, take it down to the beach. And what's really cool is this split speaker. So you can put one in the kitchen, one in the backyard at a party. Everyone's having a good time listening to the same music. Basically got like full stereo, almost surround sound system in this little package. So if you use the code AUTOREV24, you can get 10% off. So go check them out and take a listen. So you've been following along on Auto Revolution, you know that we're a big fan of Chevy OBS trucks. And Beltec Suspension has been around for 40 years, and they were one of the first innovators of the sport truck movement back in the 80s. And we've been lucky with them to partner on a few different projects, from the OBS Clash documentary series to the Tahoe Unlimited, and even a few things we've got up our sleeves coming out later this year. What's really cool is they've partnered with us to offer free shipping if you use the code AUTOREVOLUTION24 at beltec.com. So whether it's a lowering kit on your Chevy or a lift kit on your Bronco or your Jeep, and if you use the code AUTOREVOLUTION24 at beltec.com, you're going to get free shipping. Now back to the show. You talk about rock music too in the 70s, or late 60s into the 70s, where, you look at Zeppelin or Kiss or some of the bands that had just stacks of amplifiers and stacks of, cabinets and speakers and stuff on stage, or, they were playing to that style, and like, the electric guitars wailing and stuff like that. So yeah, music was becoming, you had to have some bigger stereo systems if you really wanted to enjoy the music and hear it. And, so a lot of those guys that were, rock guys kind of maybe found their way more in the business world of making those speakers.
Exactly.
A company out of Stillwater, Oklahoma, Kicker, who I think everybody, watching this that's in the car audio knows that name.
Right.
Kickers became a, kind of powerhouse in that, but they got their start actually making home stereo speakers. Yeah. Steve Irby was a, rock star guy. He obviously wanted better sound and stuff like that. And he originally was going to go to his dad and, hey, can you lend me a couple $100, which back then a couple $1,000 to buy new equipment. Right. And his dad basically was like, well, no, let's just build it. Yeah. So that's Stillwater Designs. That's how Kicker got started. Do
you know where the name comes from?
Well, I know where the name Kicker comes from. Yep. Yeah.
Because they are officially Stillwater Designs.
Yeah. Well, and that's obviously the city, that's the area and stuff. Yeah. But kind of one of the first, I think, forays they did into car audio was, he had a pickup truck. Chevy pickup truck. Yep. We love them. And wanted a speaker cabinet. Yeah. Basically behind his seat. So he made a little wedge and a little stereo box that had, some speakers and little subwoofers and an amp, and it was called the ass kicker. They called it the Kicker. Right. Well, no, it was nicknamed the ass kicker. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. Their official title was the Kicker. Yeah. And then it came from the people saying this thing really kicks me in the ass. Yeah, exactly. The bass was right there, especially in a single cab C10 truck. It was right there. Yeah. It was kind of got the nickname the ass kicker, and then turned into Kicker. Yeah. And then of course what's funny is there was a customer that had a Corvette that wanted the same thing but couldn't fit it. So they're like, okay, well, we'll make smaller versions, and basically then, okay, let's just start making them specific to certain vehicles. Right. But there's a lot of stories of kind of the early car audio industry getting started by musicians.
I've got another guy in mind, Rich Coe, who was a musician here in Southern California around the Orange County area, had a little band that he used to play in Newport Beach, and his equipment got stolen. Right? So all of a sudden he's a musician that's no equipment, out of a job.
No speakers,
got to do something. So he just started kind of grabbing whatever he could and started trying to recreate his PA system and the equipment that he needed to make his day job work for him.
Yeah.
It ended up that he started looking at this and things started to kind of make sense to put into his car.
Yeah.
Right? So, and there was nothing else around. So he developed an amplifier. He developed from basically taking apart his PA system. He was able to build his own amplifier, figure out the right cubic foot and the right space for his cabinets inside a car, and then took basically woofers out of bass cabinets and put that into the car, and voila. Now, I mentioned about the shape of a car, how the shape of a car can help intensify bass.
Yeah. Well, that's, because you're dealing with, your airspace, you're dealing with space, shape confinements, and you're dealing with maybe, curves or squares that are going to block sound waves,
right,
or mess with the sound waves.
Right. So the hilarious thing about this is that Rich didn't have the greatest luck with his first wife, and Rich had a 72 Chevelle that was his daily driver, and his wife had a 69 Volkswagen that was her daily driver. Well, in the divorce, Rich ended up with the 69 Volkswagen.
He got the bug. She got the muscle car.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was the only car he had. Obviously, wanted to try out his ideas here because he just wanted better music sound quality, and also too at the time the only thing that was available was like a 20-watt amp, right? For something that was for a home speaker.
Yeah, for a home speaker. And even then, like now that's basically like some head units maybe have 40, 50 watts.
Yeah.
That's basically enough to power the speakers, but you're not getting as much quality out of it as you could, but not even close for a subwoofer.
So what was crazy was Rich was able to build his own amp in 1975.
Yeah.
That put 1,000 watts in that Volkswagen.
And that's what's crazy.
Unheard of.
That's 1,000 watts. Yeah. And he was powering, 15-inch subs that were from a Philips, home theater unit.
Right.
So these weren't just regular speakers. This was a sound system.
Yeah.
Because even then, like going back before that, just for comparison, a year before, what was being sold retail,
right?
And Rich was involved in this company as well later on. ADS, for $500 in the 70s, they had a package that was basically a 4-inch speaker,
right?
A 1-inch tweeter, and a 160-watt amp,
right?
And obviously too, a lot of it, and what Rich probably had to figure out and find out is that those amps were meant for home power.
Yes.
Not for car,
not
12 volt power.
Right. Yeah, we're talking AC DC conversion. We're talking a 120 to a 12 volt. I mean, there's
so
a
you
lot
had to
going
get
on.
your power supply switchers, your all that kind of stuff. Even too, like the technology, like they had if you're going with your CB, FM radio, cassette, whatever, they had isolation switches to not cross frequencies and not basically have now all of your input, sound coming through all your speakers.
Right.
So just a lot of technology had to be adapted to work in a car as well, not just, hey, let's just throw some speakers in there.
Well, it was amazing that Rich had the foresight to take that bug that would just pound down the block, basically.
Literally.
Right?
Yeah.
And he would take it to the CES show in Las Vegas. And he was trying to show people, like, look, I'm doing this. And he would drag people out to the parking lot. I mean, I ran into this guy not too long ago, and he told me that he would park his car by the trash cans outside of the CES show because he wanted to be the furthest away from the show to get no other interruptions or other frequencies.
Yeah, well, frequencies and probably not people complaining. And
he would drag
down.
and he would drag people out there and he would show people his car.
Yeah.
Well, one of the guys he drove out there was Gene from Serwin Vega.
What's his last name?
Serwin. Serwin. I know it's more.
No, I mean it's not like overly complicated, but it's Gene Servinsky.
Servinsky, yes. Yeah.
So,
right. Well, Gene from Serwin Vega.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
But he was the first guy to look at this and go like, "Oh my God, you're onto something," because he was already a bass cap. I mean, he already.
Well, that's the thing. There was a lot of companies established doing home theater, concert stage, all that kind of stuff. But car audio hadn't really was still very underground or still very kind of.
And he looked at what
DIY.
he looked at what he was using. and saying like, well, wait, we can design speakers specifically for your application. And that's kind of where that, again, yes, they weren't the first, but were they the first to design something specific for a car? Pretty much.
No, and that's, you're going to get those milestones or those tipping point moments where it's the mad scientist in the back figuring out how to make things work.
Right.
To then a company or companies that are making things specifically, mass producing them, making them available, making them available to shops to be able to install those. And Richco's name's going to be brought up again further down the line. He's worked for multiple different companies.
Yes.
Some of the most iconic companies that we'll go throughout this. And currently he's the electrical engineer at Powerbass.
Correct.
We definitely like to thank Powerbass. They're helping us out and supporting us on this car audio history series that we're doing. We've kind of I've got their systems in both of our cars. And another guy that we're going to bring up there works there as well, Eric Harbour. He started out in MA Audio, Memphis Audio, sound competitions, then went, okay, we need more power to power all these sound offs and these competitions and these huge stereos. And so he was one of the founders of Kinetic Batteries.
Right.
But now he's currently the VP at Powerbass. And, they've actually been around for
quite a
almost
while.
As long as this industry has, as a manufacturer.
Right.
And then the last 25 years or so, they've kind of come out more retail with Powerbass and Image Dynamics and stuff like that. But, that's basically, for Richco, started out doing it himself in a Volkswagen. He now kind of handles all the internals and electrical engineering work at Powerbass, and he's stayed throughout this entire industry throughout the last 50 years as an innovator.
Yes.
So his name's definitely going to pop up a little bit later as well.
Well, let's talk more about that because the 70s were kind of the Wild West. I mean, obviously you had a couple guys that were doing their thing, but the 80s kind of also came in at the right time for car audio because obviously greed is good.
Well, you're talking the 80s, the luxury, you're getting more higher end vehicles, luxury vehicles, import German cars, that kind of stuff. Obviously Volkswagen Bug is an import German car, but we're talking more your Porsches.
This is when Mercedes. Your Mercedes took over Cadillac's reign. Yeah. Right? Yeah.
Well, and what's interesting though too is the 1980s were definitely the explosion.
Right.
The car audio ramping up. You had a lot of companies kind of splitting off maybe from the larger parent companies. We mentioned Motorola being kind of the first, with car audio. They were the first, for cell phones.
For a lot of things.
For a lot of different things.
Like
radios.
Walkie-talkies,
but then but what I noticed, they would partner a lot of times with smaller companies that had an idea to do it. And then sometimes those would branch off. So like Alpine Electronics.
Right.
They started out, there was a joint venture between them and Motorola.
Exactly.
And then in the late 70s when Alpine America kind of started as their own company.
Yeah.
So
which they were Japan owned.
It was about boutique. It was high quality and you got to look at the technology too that was advancing and improving. We talked about the radios of all transistor versus vacuum tube and you're talking like an amplifier that was this big and a handful of watts.
Yeah.
That wasn't going to work in a small car or something like that.
Right.
But cassette tapes obviously were very popular, but it wasn't that long into the 80s that then the CDs started to come out.
Right. They were talking about the CDs very early in the 80s.
Yeah. I mean, it's, 1984 was the Pioneer CDX1.
Yes.
This was the first CD unit.
Yes.
But a lot of the audio guys were still very anti-CD because, they're like, oh, you're never going to be able to get the quality of the tape, of it. So it's kind of funny, but that's just the cassette tape really changed because it just allowed more quality, allowed obviously more tracks, more stuff than the 8-track would.
Right.
And so that really ramped it up. But then, you look at like Alpine, we mentioned, they came out with the first digital equalizer in 1982.
Right.
So the computer age is really then what helped kind of ramp up audio as well.
Well, and also too, you mentioned the cassette. Well, the cassette was the first time for someone like yourself that could capture your music list and
That's true. You
replay
can
it.
make a mixtape.
Can make a mixtape.
You can record it
Right.
off the radio. You
Right.
could pass it around. You could do that where, yeah, you didn't have to necessarily buy an 8-track.
Right.
That was, someone branded. You could actually more reasonably do it yourself.
Exactly. And that's, again, you look at the evolution of music. At the time, the tape was still being used in recording. You still had, people that are walking into studios and still using, multi-track boards, but they're still putting it onto tape.
Yeah.
So that also, there was a little bit of a floundering issue with that until obviously digital music came in fashion. But
no, and that's the 80s too was
Right.
synthesizers,
that kinda came in,
digital,
right.
all that, the computer, processing and stuff like that. You really started to get the kind of that competition.
That's just going to mention that. Yep.
Levels that came in where you had a lot of these car audio companies. You had a lot of this stuff.
Well, if you think about it, I mean,
the sound offs,
Yeah.
started in the same time that CDs got,
Right.
84 was the first like organized kind of, sound off competition. And, they end up calling it like Thunder on Wheels. That obviously led into more organized, associations
Right.
and rules and regulations and stuff. But yeah, the early 80s was competition.
Well, but it makes sense. You got your garage guys from the 70s that are now trying
Yeah.
to show off what they've got. You've got another type of car guy now too. You've got a stereo installer.
Yeah.
Which they were totally different than the performance guy or the drag race guy or the custom paint guy. All of a sudden they're like, hey, I want to show off my stuff too. I have abilities. I know how to do this kind of stuff. So where else are you gonna do that at? Competition.
Yeah. Well, and it's the same. Yeah. You're talking about drag racing, performance, stuff like that for your speed shops and your engine
Right.
builders and all that. It's the same kind of thing when you get into the stereo stuff,
Right.
Got to have some way to show it off. But there was a handful of, from 84 to like 85, 86, some pretty crazy cars that were being built by some of these sound competition guys. And Wayne Harris was one of the first really big ones. And he actually later on founded, Term Labs, Term Pro, like
There you go.
software that would help kind of measure the dB level,
Right.
Help set some standards within that whole thing. But, his first kind of competition car in 1984 was a Buick Regal.
Right.
And he called it Eruption after the Van Halen
Yeah,
song.
yeah.
So you also got to look at, okay, what was the music being played through car audio? Things
Right.
like we got to think of that too, of time periods of what was popular.
Yeah.
So what were they playing? And maybe so that kind of dictated what they built, how they built it.
And what the system was.
Exactly,
If it's a high rock song, you don't want to have a lot of woofers. You want a lot of more mid range or a lot more mid bass. So
Yeah.
you guys were learning that. And another guy that stands out again too, the shape of the car. A Buick Grand National was the guys over at Speakerworks, which were in Orange County, and they opened up in the mid '80s, and they were kind of again another outfit that no one really knew about that started the boutique high end installations.
Yeah.
And we're talking at the time too Porsches, Lamborghinis, Ferraris, but his sound competition car was a Grand National, and I don't know if that was just he was a fan of it. Right, Roger.
Well,
was
I mean,
just a
that's
fan
the
of
thing.
it.
I mean, at that time,
But
Grand
that was-
National was going to be a newer car. It
That's-
wasn't like
yeah.
it was, some old car that they had.
Right,
but-
right. And, that thing won multiple years of all these.
Well, and I think maybe too with those sound competitions, and it depends if it's, your SBL or SQL, your sound quality versus your just DB level. What space did you have to work with? What could you
Right.
accomplish? So like, yeah, we talked about Richco putting 215s and some speakers and a 1,000-watt amp in a Volkswagen.
Right.
Yeah, you had that space, but that was all you could fit,
Right,
more or
right.
less. And so later on, like, your vans or your Astro vans, your Blazers, your hatchbacks, your
Yeah.
trucks would get, very popular. But just going back real quick to Wayne Harris, the next year, his follow-up car, I mean, think of what older kind of cool car you could do at that time that would be able to fit as much as you wanted to.
I'd say a
in there.
wagon probably.
How about a hearse?
Oh, well, there you go.
So
right.
the Terminator
That's right.
was the Cadillac hearse.
Yes.
But here's the really cool thing too. So, it had 4 12-inch subs.
Sure.
There was 50 cubic feet of airspace.
Yeah.
That he had to work with.
Yeah.
We're talking like most speaker boxes, sub boxes, or like sub, you go, hey, you need at least 0.65 cubic feet.
Yeah.
You need 1 or 2 cubic feet.
Yeah.
So he had 50 cubic feet of space to play with. So he had 23 speakers, 7 amplifiers. It had a navigation system, which I know at the time, like OEMs were starting to play a little with that, but this is 85.
Yeah.
It also, to control these and manage the system and these speakers, it had an Apple II computer in there.
See?
So, and it had a phone and a VCR and a CD player.
Of course.
In 85.
Yeah.
So literally everything you could throw at it was in the Terminator.
But that was, at that time in the early 80s, this is kind of before like you'll see like the walls of woofers.
Yeah.
Right?
And your cars 80s, that go boom and your truck beds. And,
right. Early 80s was about the installation. It was about like you'd look around the car and you wouldn't see a thing, but you would hear it.
Yeah.
And that's what and those installers, that's what they were striding for. And
they're also showing off their skills.
They're showing off their skills, totally. And if you look at the cars that were important to them at that time, they were trying to get off of the expensive car because they wanted that to be expensive. They wanted car audio to be unique and be an elite. So you had your Porsche installs. That's why I go back. Your Lamborghinis, Porsches, Mercedes. But then there was also, like you mentioned, music changed. So the music got to the point where, hey, I like a lot of bass, all of a sudden,
rap and hip hop music became way more popular in the mid 80s.
Right.
You talked about Aerosmith earlier, the whole Run DMC Aerosmith collab in the mid 80s helped bring hip hop to the mainstream.
Exactly.
For a lot of people. And so, it then became about the bass.
Right.
Came about that sound that catered to, the sound system that people were into.
Right. And at first it was, again, still based on music. You looked at your normal bass box and it was 2 woofers and 2 horns.
Yeah.
Something very similar to a PA system.
Oh, no, completely.
Right.
That's every PA system you look at is large woofer and a horn or something similar.
So that was kind of, again, those guys were looking back at that. It wasn't until some of the guys in the 80s said, wait, if I add multiple woofers and if I can run them in series, now I can produce more decibels. And that's when we start getting the cracked windshields and we get the vibrating, Well,
and a lot of that too, I think, had to do with
rascals in the trunk.
It had to do with the car audio companies that were coming about.
Right.
Your Memphis Audio, your MA Audio, your Pioneer, Alpine, your all these different companies that started to come out that were sponsoring these guys, sponsoring these competitions. Your JL Audio, your Kenwood, Clarion, all these companies that were sponsoring these guys.
Right.
So they wanted to be able to brag that, hey, this Pioneer system just hit 160 dB.
Right.
And just for reference, because we're going to be getting into a lot of these and these high dB levels. So 110 decibels is your average, is like being at your average concert.
Okay.
That's pretty loud. 130 is like your jet engines, that's when it starts to get annoying.
Right.
And maybe a little bit painful. You get into 160 dBs, your eardrum's going.
Right.
It's gone.
Yeah.
You get beyond that, start getting into what, the current levels are over 180 decibels.
Right.
That's, depending on how far you are from that or from wherever, that's heart failure.
Exactly.
That's gone.
Right.
And that's what's crazy now is like it was only, a few years ago that they broke the 180 dB mark.
It's insane.
And that was done by Scott Owens on a Ford F-250.
Okay.
That, we were talking with Eric Harbour at Powerbass. He was also at Kinetic, and Kinetic sponsored him and powered that, and then had, Pioneer subs. But like, he had built that truck so tuned to hit that mark in a specific spot where the microphone will be placed, or the decibel reader, whatever would be placed, that, it had where the cars would, the doors would, contract and sink in to seal off the air pressure.
Right.
He had it where he could tune it to where, okay, I'm in this city, the elevation's this, the barometric pressure, the humidity, the air temperature, because that all changes the density of the air, the output of it to really hone in. So it's the same as your IndyCar, driver, your NASCAR driver that's
setting a clutch up for this race or setting the fuel curve for this race.
It's all same that thing. Technical.
Yeah.
But it did then mean that a lot of those competitions, we get into the different organizations of, IASCA, your, USAC, your MECAs and stuff like that, where they had their regulations and their rules and stuff. But some of them became very about how can we hit that tone at that decibel level.
Yeah.
But then, of course, you'll have some of those that would then go for the quality level.
Right.
So what frequencies could you hear? How, and maybe some of the subjective stuff of just the quality then, more the quality level of the installation.
Right.
How does it look good, but it also performs?
Yeah.
It's comparing drag racing to show cars.
Same thing.
Right. It's, this has, 1,000 horsepower. Well, that's got 1,000 horsepower, but it looks really nice.
Right.
And it could perform, but you're probably not going that crazy with it.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how the car audio industry really started to go in the 80s as well.
As a teenager from the 80s, I'll have to say that it was very important as a status symbol to have, and this is another hilarious thing, because yes, as car audio got more expensive and more quality, there also became more theft.
Yeah.
Right. So literally, guys, you'd walk outside in your car, the head unit would be ripped out of your dash and, you're violated. Right. Mm-hmm. So then out, came the pull-out chassis, as they called it.
Yeah. Well, Kenwood.
Right.
In 1984, so CDs started coming out. Well, they had the first pull-out unit.
Yep.
And that was funny. It was a briefcase.
Oh, no. I carried one around for my high school days and put it on my desk every day. So they weighed considerably amount of weight too.
Well, because you had all the internals and stuff like that, and
they were built like bricks. There was not a lot of plastic on them. There was a lot of aluminum, but not a lot of plastic.
Yeah, you had the whole chassis.
So that was the whole chassis thing, which that also morphed into the faceless or the faceplate radios.
Yeah, the detachable faceplate, and that's Pioneer was the first to come out with a detachable faceplate, and that was in 1989.
Yep. Which was a game changer too. Wasn't the greatest radio, but people bought it because they could put it in their pocket.
I do remember that because, like I said, you were growing up in the 80s, I was growing up in the 90s. Yeah. Me and my family, I was heavily into music from a very early age, and would remember, I finally remember when it would be a point where, I had the Discman to CDs, and then my parents' car still had tape deck,
right?
But it had the adapter. I can plug the tape into the deal, or there was also ones where you could run it off like the FM, you tune to a certain radio
channel
station,
that's right.
and then that would play. That would connect with the quality wasn't
89.5 or whatever, and you would tune that in there.
Yeah, it was some because it was. I remember, it was down near the college stations or something like that. But that was how you could do that if you weren't spending the money in the install to do an actual unit. But I do remember when my brother got his own car and had a head unit in there with I remember pop out,
and pop and
go
pop,
left,
yep.
grab it, and then of course I always remember he would just throw it in the glove box. But
which most people did.
That would be the first place people would look. They go, oh, he's got a detachable. It's kind of one of those things. It's the pull out. Okay, it's gone
with you.
It's gone.
Yeah.
But the detachable face, once you saw, unless it was at nighttime or something, once you saw that there was no radio in there, you knew, okay, this guy has a nice radio.
Right. So what else is in there? Probably has some nice
speakers.
Yeah.
And maybe, he just tossed it under the seat or in the glove box. Yeah. It's kind of almost more of an invite to break in. And that's, of course, we're not going to go too far down car alarms and security stuff. It's related.
Yeah.
Your car stereo shop's going to install it, but your Viper alarms, your all that kind of really came into play because a lot of break-ins were happening where it wasn't stealing the car, it was stealing the stereo.
Radio. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Caught him in my car trying to steal the Alpine. That's even they used the line, into popular culture.
Yeah. What song was it?
Easy
E. Yeah.
Right.
Well, and that's the same thing. Yeah. Easy referenced Alpine multiple times. Because it's then I let the Alpine play. It was bumping new shit by NWA.
Right.
Caught him in
my car trying to steal the Alpine.
Right. Even then, you talk about, then Vanilla Ice later on, obviously in the early 90s about, bumping the Alpine
Right.
and letting it play. 89 was kind of another, let's back up a little bit. The 80s technology really started to advance more. The CD changer
Oh, yes.
coming about in 86 by Sony,
Right.
a couple years before that, was when the CD player came out. So very few people had a CD head unit.
Right.
Well, now all of a sudden now you can throw 5 or 6 or whatever, mount it in the trunk.
Yep.
And have the CD changer going.
Yeah.
And I remember too of like, my dad had a Lincoln Mark 8 or something like that, and it had it in their factory.
Right.
It had a CD changer factory in the.
Well, and that
time
happened.
period.
That happened the late '80s, early '90s. You had a lot of the aftermarket companies that were now collabing.
Yeah.
Back with the manufacturers.
And one of the early years, and that still would go on is Delco, being
Yeah.
a GM brand,
Right.
But Delco and Bose,
Right.
Partnering,
yes.
and to make the higher end systems and like your Cadillacs
Right.
and multiple other cars,
Yeah.
But yeah, so the OEM integrations really started to happen. Mentioned the CD changer, but what's considered like the holy grail CD player is an Alpine 7909.
I had one.
and I'm sure a lot of you guys could kind of visualize what that looks like. You
Yep.
had those
The big
those
green buttons.
6 or whatever green
Yes,
buttons for
yep,
the
yep.
presets.
Presets. Yep.
Had that kind of backflow.
Round knob. Now, but
And-
go ahead.
No, but same. But the guy that created that, and it's still a sought after, still considered like the high end for your audiophiles is Richco when he was
right.
working at Alpine.
Yeah. Well, and the reason why that one is so revered is because the technology at the time allowed it to happen. You had
Yeah.
Dolby, you had DTS, you had Brown system. All of that technology all went into the 7909. So that's why it's kind of revered as that top of the line, because you've got all of the best sound techniques,
All the quality, all the technology
put into that one
put
one
into
head
that.
unit.
Yeah. And that, like I said, that was kind of the quintessential head unit
Right.
for that. And it was a CD player.
Yeah. Now that's still
It's still
That's
sought
a-
after, but
yeah.
I was looking up. So like right now you can get one of those on eBay for about $1,000.
oh, Jesus.
Well, but brand new back then.
Yeah.
It was $1,200.
Wow. That takes me back a different way. I bought mine for $400, but I didn't buy it from an Alpine dealer.
When did you buy it? And was it stolen?
I'm gonna say, statute of limitations ran out. So.
Yeah.
But I bought mine for $400. So the black market still was fairly, healthy.
No, I mean, but you got to consider back
Yeah.
then, 400, and like right now, like $400 for a head unit is like
It's crazy. Yeah.
like high end. You're getting everything that's
Yeah.
got CarPlay, that's got
Right.
everything you could think of on it. And
Yeah.
you're spending more than that. But I remember even 10, 15 years ago where your head unit, whether it was like a flip out screen
Yeah.
or even just a single DIN, if it was good quality and like had a lot of the features, you were still spending 800 something bucks.
Right.
You're still spending some good amount of money.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the late 80s into the early 90s was really definitely the golden era of
Yeah.
it. And we mentioned the Cars That Go Boom, that was showing off, and the song was, some of the musicians and the rap, hip hop producers started making songs to play in cars.
Oh, absolutely. Right.
Where
Yeah.
it was gonna be something where you'd cruise down Whittier Boulevard,
Yeah.
you'd cruise Van Nuys, you'd cruise I-95 in Miami, and
Right.
and you'd be bumping it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, I played the hell out of Give It All You Got just because my system would hit perfect on that.
Well, and that's some of those songs started to become something that was kind of standards.
Yeah.
Especially talking about the DB drags or the SBL competitions, the sound offs. Later on, some of them would make CDs that were specific towards what they wanted, or there
Right.
were certain bass tones, that would kind of, run the spectrum,
Yeah.
like that, and they would show off what your system could do.
Right.
But, there are songs like Flashdance.
I know.
The introduction to Flashdance was like basically that was what everyone used to get their dB levels or
Right.
get their, their high points and
Well,
stuff like that.
I guess now I'm a year old on this one because I did not know this, but last year at the SEMA show, when we were in the audio hall, which is now the North Hall,
Yeah.
I noticed that everybody was playing this one song
It's a good song.
it's a good song, but I mean, for me, it's also, I was like 21 when it came out.
Yeah.
So I'm like, why are we playing a 30-year-old, but everyone's playing it.
Yeah.
And I didn't get the fact that In Too Deep, Back to the Hotel
Yeah.
has that frequency drop that all those guys are looking for.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But if you're a guy that doesn't know that, you're just walking around going like, is it a tribute show to, In Too Deep? What's going on?
No,
But that's why.
yeah. You're talking about, current technology playing
A 30-year-old song.
songs.
Right.
But it's all about that frequency and that, thing to show it off. And what's kind of interesting and funny too of like SEMA, at least for example, I haven't been to CES in many years, but there's certain rules for the audio hall to not get too crazy and have
Right.
everyone competing for it. It's like, okay, you get, 5 minutes of full audio for every hour. Or
Right.
something. So that way it kind of rotates around
Yeah.
the hall of who's, blasting it and
Right.
stuff like that. So it doesn't get too crazy.
Yeah.
But you're talking a lot of the CES shows, Alpine campaign, like the Cannes show.
Yeah.
A lot of these universities and like these conventions and trade shows started to pop up obviously around
Right.
the car audio industry.
Yeah.
And it, really started to grow. The early 90s, into the mid 90s, that was also when kind of more the car entertainment really started to kind of happen.
Right.
Whereas before it was just music.
And again, I got to learn. And again, I got to look to technology of that one because you have all of a sudden the Walkman or the Discman now is turning into the iPod.
Well,
Right?
and that's, I mean, 2001
We're starting to look at that.
is when the iPod came out.
Right.
So you look at retail wise, but then backtrack a few years.
Yeah.
Into the late 90s is when MP3 technology
Correct.
came about, where you could listen to something digitally. Now, back then too, like if you were at 120 kilobyte, you were a star, and that compression level was horrible for music.
Right.
So a lot of guys still stuck to CDs,
Yeah.
especially for the sound competitions. But you started to see DVDs
Right.
coming in where you had, some people would put like a VHS player
Right.
with a little screen,
Little small screen in there,
their
yeah.
car, but like you weren't getting a whole lot. But as soon as DVDs
Yeah.
became popular and screen technology got better, you were starting to get, a headrest monitors
Yeah.
or flip down monitors that were playing all that.
Well, we
So-
went from the car audio age into the car electronics age or the
Yeah.
mobile electronics age, where you had multiple items that you would either bring to your car or were part of your car. Because let's face it, late 90s, late 80s, early 90s, car phones were car phones.
Yeah.
It wasn't a cell phone. It was a car phone. It was actually
attached to your
the
thing
car,
and
right?
integrated into all of that.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's when we start to see like, well, why are we attached to that? Why do we have wires? Why are we like, now we're talking about Bluetooth and it didn't come out yet, but now that technology is starting to come about.
It's starting to all kind of creep in where there's kind of a next level of car audio, car entertainment, where it's becoming more about maybe OEM integration, becoming more about the quality level, the installations, and stuff versus, hey, I've got 12 subwoofers in a wall behind me,
Right.
or I got 6 15s in the bed,
Yeah.
and
I can bust out my windshield.
I can bust out my windshield, but when we talk about like the TV screens and talk about all that stuff, like it kind of went to that point too, where you just had a TV screen, like you go, here's a TV screen.
Yeah.
There's a TV screen. Oh, there's a TV screen. Like everywhere you looked, you had a TV screen. So
Right.
Everything always kind of ramps up and goes crazy before it kind of cycles back. So, I think we're going to dive definitely more into the technology, the OEM integrations, your GPS navigations and kind of where the car audio industry kind of transitioned into from, the days of the crazy sound systems, on the next episode. So this is actually kind of the first time where it makes sense to say stay tuned for that.
But